Emma Hartwell stared at the stack of medical bills scattered across her kitchen table, each one a reminder of how quickly life could spiral beyond control. At 25, she had never imagined that her father's sudden heart attack would not only threaten his life, but also destroy their family's financial stability. The experimental treatment that could save him cost more than their modest home was worth, and insurance had denied coverage, dismissing it as investigational. Her phone rang, interrupting her calculations for the 100th time that week. The caller ID showed her best friend Sarah, but Emma let it go to voicemail. She couldn't bear another well-meaning conversation about options that didn't exist. 3 jobs barely covered their basic expenses, let alone the $200,000 needed for her father's treatment. Traditional loans were impossible with their damaged credit, and crowdfunding had raised less than 5% of what they needed. The envelope that arrived that afternoon seemed ordinary enough, cream-colored paper with elegant letterhead from Stone Enterprises. Emma almost threw it away, assuming it was another collection notice disguised in expensive stationery. Instead, she found herself reading the most unusual proposition of her life. The letter was brief, professionally written, and utterly shocking in its directness. Alexander Stone, CEO of Stone Enterprises, and one of the city's most eligible bachelors, was offering her a marriage contract. Not a romantic proposal, but a business arrangement with terms that made her hands shake as she read them. 2 years of marriage in name only, separate living arrangements, minimal public appearances, and in exchange, all her father's medical expenses would be covered, plus a substantial sum that would secure her family's future. The letter concluded with a phone number and the words that would haunt her for days. Some problems require unconventional solutions. If you're interested in discussing this arrangement, call within 48 hours. Emma read the letter 3 times before the reality sank in. Someone had been watching her family's struggles, and Alexander Stone believed she was desperate enough to accept his offer. Chapter 2. The Meeting. Emma spent 2 sleepless nights debating whether to make the call. She researched Alexander Stone obsessively, finding hundreds of articles about his business empire, his philanthropy, and his notably private personal life. At 32, he was devastatingly handsome in a cold, unapproachable way, with dark hair and intense green eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw. His last serious relationship had ended 3 years ago, and since then, he'd been photographed with various socialites at charity events, but never the same woman twice. When she finally dialed the number, a polite assistant scheduled a meeting for the following evening at Stone Enterprises' corporate headquarters. Emma borrowed her friend's best dress and spent her last $20 on a cab to the gleaming 40-story building that housed Alexander's empire. The executive floor was a study in understated luxury, all dark wood and modern art that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Alexander Stone was waiting in his office, standing behind an enormous mahogany desk, with the city lights creating a dramatic backdrop behind him. He was taller than his photos suggested, with an imposing presence that made the spacious office feel smaller. His tailored suit probably cost more than Emma made in 6 months, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. Intelligent, calculating, but not unkind. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice deep and professionally neutral. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk, but remained standing himself, a subtle power play that wasn't lost on Emma. "I assume you've read my proposal and have questions." Emma forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to be intimidated despite the enormous disparity in their circumstances. "I have many questions, Mr. Stone. Starting with why you chose me, and what you really expect to get out of this arrangement." Alexander's lips curved in what might have been approval at her directness. For the first time since entering his office, Emma felt like she might have some control in this conversation. Chapter 3. The Negotiation. Alexander walked around his desk and sat in the chair beside Emma rather than behind the imposing mahogany barrier. The gesture was calculated to put her more at ease, but Emma recognized the manipulation even as she appreciated it. Up close, she could see the exhaustion lines around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders that suggested he was under more pressure than his polished exterior revealed. "I need a wife for business reasons," he said without preamble. "My grandfather's will stipulates that I must be married before my 33rd birthday to maintain control of the family trust. Without that trust, I lose voting control of the company I've spent my entire adult life building." His honesty was surprising, given how carefully he'd constructed his public image. Emma studied his face, looking for signs of deception. "So you're essentially paying me to save your company?" Alexander nodded. "In essence, yes, but I chose you specifically because you need something I can provide, and you're not part of my social circle. This arrangement will be complicated enough without emotional entanglements or social obligations." He pulled out a thick contract and placed it between them. 2 years, as I mentioned in my letter. We'll maintain separate residences, though you'll have access to a furnished apartment in my building for appearances. Public events maybe once a month, always with advance notice. No social media posts about our relationship. Complete financial security for your family, including your father's treatment, which will begin immediately upon signing. Emma's eyes widened at the financial terms. It was more money than she could have dreamed of. Enough to not only save her father, but secure her entire family's future. "What about personal relationships?" she asked carefully. Alexander's expression didn't change. "Discreet liaisons are acceptable, but no public relationships. The last thing either of us needs is tabloid speculation about the state of our marriage." The clinical nature of his proposal should have been reassuring, but Emma found herself oddly disappointed by his emotionless delivery. This was business, nothing more, and she needed to remember that. Chapter 4. The contract signing. Emma spent 3 days reviewing the contract with a lawyer recommended by Alexander's office. The terms were more generous than she'd expected, with clauses protecting her interests and guaranteeing her financial security, even if the arrangement ended. Alexander had clearly anticipated every possible complication and addressed them with the thoroughness of someone who left nothing to chance. The signing took place in Alexander's office on a rainy Thursday morning. Emma wore her most professional outfit, a navy blue dress that was respectable but clearly off the rack compared to the designer clothing worn by everyone else in the building. She felt out of place, but determined to project confidence she didn't feel. Alexander reviewed each section of the contract with her one final time, his voice steady and businesslike. "Are you certain about this, Miss Hartwell? Once we sign, there's no backing out without significant legal and financial consequences for both of us." Emma thought of her father, pale and weak in his hospital bed, waiting for a treatment that could save his life. "I'm certain," she said, taking the pen he offered. Her signature looked small and uncertain next to his bold, confident handwriting, but it was done. They were legally bound to each other for the next 2 years, though they were still essentially strangers. "The ceremony is scheduled for next Friday," Alexander said, closing the contract file. "Small, private, just witnesses and an officiant. You'll receive an appointment card for dress shopping. My assistant will handle the arrangements." He stood and extended his hand for a formal handshake. "Congratulations, Miss Hartwell. You've just solved both our problems." As Emma shook his hand, she wondered if she'd made the deal of a lifetime or the biggest mistake she'd ever made. Time would tell whether Alexander Stone was her salvation or something else entirely. Either way, there was no going back now. Chapter 5. The Wedding Day. The wedding took place in the small chapel of the city's most exclusive country club, a venue that probably cost more for one day than Emma's family spent on housing in a year. She wore a simple but elegant designer dress that Alexander's assistant had selected, ivory silk that fit perfectly thanks to the 3 fittings she'd been required to attend. Looking at herself in the mirror that morning, Emma hardly recognized the sophisticated woman staring back at her. Alexander's side of the chapel was populated by business associates and his assistant, all wearing expensive suits and politely neutral expressions. Emma's side held her parents and Sarah, looking slightly overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding them. Her father was in a wheelchair, already noticeably stronger thanks to the treatments that had begun the day after the contract signing. The ceremony itself was brief and formal, more like a business meeting than a wedding. Alexander spoke his vows with the same professional tone he used in boardroom presentations, while Emma struggled to keep her voice steady as she promised to love and honor a man she barely knew. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Alexander's kiss was quick, formal, and completely passionless. The reception was an elegant affair in the club's main dining room, with a small cake and champagne that probably cost more per bottle than Emma used to spend on groceries in a month. Alexander played the role of attentive groom perfectly, keeping his hand on the small of her back and smiling at appropriate moments. But Emma could feel the distance he maintained even while touching her. "You're very good at this," Emma murmured during their obligatory first dance. Alexander's arms were strong and sure as he led her around the small dance floor, but his touch felt impersonal, like he was handling a valuable but fragile business asset. "Good at what?" he asked, his voice low enough that their audience couldn't hear. "Pretending," Emma replied. Alexander's steps never faltered, but she felt him tense slightly. "I'm not pretending anything, Mrs. Stone. I'm fulfilling my contractual obligations." The use of her new name sent an unexpected shiver through Emma, though she couldn't tell if it was excitement or apprehension. Chapter 6. The Separate Worlds. After the wedding, Emma moved into the furnished apartment Alexander had provided in his building. It was a beautiful space on the 35th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering stunning city views and expensive furniture that looked like it had never been used. Everything was perfect, impersonal, and utterly lacking in warmth, much like her new husband. Alexander lived in the penthouse 40 floors above her, and Emma rarely saw him except for their scheduled public appearances. Their lives ran on parallel tracks that intersected only when business required it. He was punctual for every charity gala and business dinner where they needed to appear as a couple, playing his role flawlessly while maintaining the emotional distance specified in their contract. Emma struggled to find her place in this new world. The apartment came with a generous monthly allowance that eliminated all her financial worries, but left her feeling purposeless and isolated. She couldn't work her previous jobs anymore. Being married to Alexander Stone came with expectations about how she spent her time. His assistant had even enrolled her in etiquette classes and provided a stylist to help her navigate the social requirements of being a billionaire's wife. The most difficult part was the loneliness. Emma had expected the marriage to be businesslike and impersonal, but she hadn't anticipated how isolated she would feel living in Alexander's rarefied world. The wives of his business associates were polite but distant, clearly viewing her as a temporary inconvenience in their social circle. She was too wealthy now to relate to her old friends, but not established enough to find acceptance in her new environment. 3 months into the marriage, Emma began volunteering at the hospital where her father had received treatment. Working with families facing similar crises gave her a sense of purpose and reminded her why she'd made the deal with Alexander in the first place. It also made her appreciate the magnitude of what he'd done for her family, even if his motives were purely selfish. Chapter 7. Unexpected Encounters. One evening in late October, Emma returned to her apartment to find Alexander waiting in her living room. He was still in his business suit but had loosened his tie, and he held a glass of whiskey that he'd apparently poured from the bar she never used. It was the first time he'd been in her space since helping her move in, and his presence made the large apartment feel oddly intimate. "We need to talk about the Harrison Industries merger announcement next week," he said without preamble. "The press conference will require us to appear together as a united front. There will be questions about our marriage, and I need to know you're prepared to handle them appropriately." Emma set down her purse and studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way he held his shoulders. She'd become quite good at reading his moods during their public appearances, though he probably didn't realize it. "What kind of questions?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him rather than the sofa where he sat. "The usual invasive nonsense about our relationship timeline, our future plans, whether we're happy." Alexander's tone suggested he found such questions beneath his notice, but Emma detected something else, a weariness that went deeper than simple annoyance. "I've prepared answers for you to memorize. Standard responses that will satisfy their curiosity without providing ammunition for speculation." Emma found herself irritated by his assumption that she needed scripted responses. "I think I can handle talking about my own marriage. I've been managing our public appearances just fine without a script." He looked surprised by her mild challenge, as if he'd forgotten she had opinions beyond agreement with his plans. "You've done very well," he admitted, his tone softening slightly. "Better than I expected, actually. You're quite convincing when you need to be." There was something almost like approval in his voice, and Emma felt an unexpected flutter of pleasure at his praise. Chapter 8. Cracks in the Facade. The Harrison Industries press conference went better than expected, with Emma fielding personal questions with grace and humor that seemed to genuinely surprise Alexander. She found herself enjoying the verbal sparring with reporters, particularly when they tried to dig for gossip about her whirlwind romance with one of the city's most eligible bachelors. "Mrs. Stone, some people are calling your marriage a business arrangement rather than a love match. How do you respond to those rumors?" The question came from a particularly aggressive tabloid reporter, but Emma smiled serenely and reached for Alexander's hand. "I think people who believe that don't understand how attraction works," she said, meeting Alexander's eyes with a look that was part acting, part challenge. "Sometimes you meet someone and know immediately that they're going to change your life. Alexander did that for me." The lie came easily, but as she spoke, Emma realized it wasn't entirely false. After the press conference, Alexander was unusually quiet during their ride back to the building. Emma watched the city pass by through the limousine's tinted windows, noting how the late afternoon light cast everything in golden tones that made even the urban landscape look romantic. She was learning to appreciate beauty in ways she'd never had time for before. "That was well done," Alexander said. "Your answer about attraction was particularly effective." Emma turned to study his profile, noting the way his jaw tensed when he was thinking. "It wasn't entirely an act," she said quietly. "You did change my life, just not in the way people assume." Alexander met her eyes, and for a moment, the careful distance he maintained seemed to waver. Emma felt something electric pass between them, a recognition of possibilities neither of them had acknowledged. Then he looked away, and the moment passed, leaving Emma wondering if she'd imagined the connection. That night, she stood at her apartment windows looking up toward the penthouse floors, wondering what Alexander was doing and whether he ever thought about her beyond their contractual obligations. Chapter 9. The Breakthrough. A month before their first wedding anniversary, everything changed. Emma was working late at the hospital when Alexander appeared in the volunteer lounge, still in his business suit but looking uncharacteristically disheveled. He'd never visited her workplace before, and seeing him in the context of her volunteer work, surrounded by worried families and medical equipment rather than boardrooms and luxury, made him seem more human somehow. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble, then noticed the curious stares from other volunteers. Privately, Emma led him to a small conference room, noting how out of place his expensive suit looked among the institutional furniture and motivational posters about patient advocacy. "Is something wrong?" Emma asked, suddenly worried that he wanted to end their arrangement early. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, destroying its usual perfect styling. "My grandfather is dying," he said bluntly. "The doctors think he has maybe a week." Emma felt genuine sympathy pierce through her surprise. She'd never heard Alexander mention his grandfather except in business contexts, but the pain in his voice suggested a relationship that went far deeper than legal inheritance required. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Were you close?" Alexander's laugh was bitter. "He raised me after my parents died. He's the only family I have left, and he's been asking to meet my wife properly. Not at some corporate event where we're performing for cameras, but as his grandson and the woman he married." The vulnerability in his voice was unlike anything Emma had heard from him before. "He wants us to have dinner at his house this weekend. He wants to—" Alexander paused, looking uncomfortable. "He wants to give us his blessing before he dies. Which means we need to convince him that our marriage is real." Emma understood the dilemma immediately. They'd become experts at fooling strangers and reporters, but deceiving a dying old man who knew Alexander intimately would require a level of intimacy they'd never attempted. "What do you need from me?" Emma asked, already knowing she would do whatever he asked, not because of their contract, but because she recognized genuine grief when she saw it. Chapter 10. Preparing the Deception. Alexander's grandfather lived in the family estate outside the city, a sprawling colonial mansion that spoke of old money and established traditions. Emma spent the week before their visit learning everything she could about Alexander's childhood and family history. He proved surprisingly forthcoming with personal details when the stakes were high enough, sharing stories about the grandfather who had essentially become his parent, and the pressure of inheriting not just wealth, but legacy. "He's going to ask about children," Alexander warned during one of their preparation sessions in his penthouse office. Emma had never been in his private space before, and she was surprised by how lived-in it felt compared to her sterile apartment. Books were stacked on tables, a half-finished crossword puzzle lay open beside his coffee cup, and family photos she'd never seen before stood on the mantelpiece. "What should I say?" Emma asked, studying a photo of teenage Alexander with an elderly man who had the same green eyes and determined jaw. "That we're trying but want to wait until the business is more stable. He'll understand that. He waited 5 years after marrying my grandmother before they had my father." Emma found herself genuinely curious about the family dynamics that had shaped Alexander into the complex man he'd become. What was he like as a guardian? Alexander's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before, demanding but fair. He taught me that success requires sacrifice, but he also made sure I understood that some things were more important than business. Family, loyalty, keeping your word. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were planning to lie to a man who had taught Alexander the importance of keeping his word. But Emma could see how much his grandfather's approval meant to him, and she found herself wanting to help him succeed, not because of their contract, but because she was beginning to care about his happiness. They practiced their story until it felt natural, creating a romantic narrative about their meeting and courtship that blended truth with fiction. Emma was surprised to discover how easily they fell into the rhythm of a real couple when they made the effort. Chapter 11. Meeting the Grandfather. Charles Stone was nothing like Emma had expected. Despite his illness, he was sharp-eyed and charming, with a warmth that Alexander had inherited but learned to hide behind his professional facade. The family estate was beautiful but comfortable, filled with antiques and family photos that told the story of generations of Stones who had built and maintained their fortune through intelligence and determination. "So, you're the young woman who finally captured my grandson's heart," Charles said, taking Emma's hands in his papery but still strong grip. "I was beginning to think he was too much like me in my younger days, too focused on business to appreciate what really matters in life." Emma found herself genuinely liking the old, which made their deception feel more complicated. She and Alexander had prepared extensively, but being in his grandfather's presence felt different than performing for strangers. Charles asked probing questions about their relationship with the skill of someone who had spent decades evaluating people and their motivations. During dinner, Alexander was more relaxed than Emma had ever seen him, sharing childhood memories and family stories that revealed a man very different from the cold businessman she'd married. She found herself laughing at his stories and adding details to their fictional courtship that felt surprisingly natural. "You know," Charles said during dessert, "I've been worried about Alexander for years. He's been so focused on the business that I thought he'd forgotten how to be happy. But watching you two together tonight, I can see that he's found something special." The genuine affection in his voice made Emma's throat tighten with guilt. After dinner, Charles insisted on showing Emma his garden, leaving Alexander inside to take an important phone call. As they walked among the late autumn flowers, Charles took her arm for support and spoke quietly. "I know about the contract, my dear." Emma's heart stopped, but Charles continued calmly. "I know about the inheritance requirements and the business pressures. I may be dying, but I'm not senile." Emma started to protest, but he held up a hand. "What I also know is that what started as business has become something else. I can see it in how you look at each other when you think no one is watching." Chapter 12. The Revelation. Emma spent the entire drive back to the city in stunned silence, processing Charles's words and their implications. Alexander seemed equally shaken by his grandfather's revelation, though he covered it with his usual professional composure. Neither of them spoke until they reached their building, where Alexander surprised Emma by asking if he could come up to her apartment. "Did you know he knew?" Emma asked as soon as they were behind closed doors. Alexander shook his head, pouring himself a drink from the bar with hands that weren't quite steady. "He's always been too perceptive for his own good. I should have realized he'd figure it out." "He said something else," Emma continued carefully, "about what started as business becoming something else. Did you tell him that? Or did he just assume?" Alexander was quiet for so long that Emma thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't tell him." But he wasn't wrong. Alexander met her eyes, and Emma saw uncertainty there for the first time since she'd known him. "These past months, spending time with you, watching you handle everything with such grace, it stopped being just business for me weeks ago." Emma felt her heart racing as the careful distance they'd maintained began to crumble. "Alexander," she started, but he continued talking, as if afraid he'd lose his nerve if he stopped. "I know this complicates everything. I know our contract specifies emotional boundaries, and I know you agreed to this arrangement for your family, not for any romantic feelings toward me. But I can't pretend anymore that I don't care about you beyond our business relationship." Emma moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his green eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. What if I told you that it stopped being just business for me too? What if I said that somewhere along the way, I started falling for the man behind the contract? The kiss that followed was nothing like their formal wedding kiss. It was hungry, desperate, and full of months of suppressed attraction and growing affection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "What happens now?" Emma whispered. "Now," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion, "we stop pretending and see what this could really be." Chapter 13. The New Beginning. 6 months later, Emma woke up in Alexander's bed for the first time, sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows, and Alexander's arm wrapped securely around her waist. Their transition from contractual marriage to real relationship had been gradual but inevitable, built on months of learning to trust each other and discovering that their initial compatibility went far deeper than either had imagined. They'd had their contract legally modified to reflect their changed circumstances, though Emma often joked that the new version was far more complicated than the original business arrangement. Love, it turned out, required much more negotiation than a simple financial transaction, but the rewards were infinitely greater. Alexander's grandfather had lived long enough to see their relationship evolve into something genuine, passing away peacefully in his sleep with the satisfaction of knowing his grandson had found not just a wife, but a true partner. Emma had been surprised by her own grief at losing the sharp-eyed old man who had seen through their deception and helped them find their truth. The business world had been initially skeptical of their marriage, but Emma's intelligence and Alexander's obvious devotion to her had gradually won over even the most cynical observers. She'd found her place in his world not by changing herself, but by bringing her own strengths to their partnership. Her work with medical charity organizations had become a significant part of Stone Enterprises' philanthropic efforts. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked one morning as they shared coffee and the financial papers on their terrace. "Signing the contract with a stranger, instead of holding out for a traditional romance?" Emma considered the question seriously, as she always did when Alexander asked about her feelings. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember that I might never have met you otherwise. We moved in completely different worlds before this brought us together. Besides," she added, stealing a piece of his croissant, "what we have now is better than any romance novel. We chose each other twice, once out of necessity and once out of love. How many people can say that?" Alexander smiled, the warm, genuine expression that he saved for her, and that still made her heart skip a beat. "I love you, Mrs. Stone. Contract or no contract." "I love you too, Mr. Stone," Emma replied. "Lucky for us, we have it in writing." Thank you for listening to Emma and Alexander's story. Love truly can find us in the most unexpected circumstances, and sometimes the most practical decisions lead to the most beautiful outcomes. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and let us know where you're listening from around the world. We love hearing from our global audience and learning about the different places our stories reach.